Good afternoon, good evening. It is midweek motivation time, and we are excited about tonight's midweek motivation. I can't tell you enough how glad I am to have made it to another Wednesday. As you get this notification, do me a favor, please. Would you just comment as well as like, as well as share this page? This conversation that I'm getting ready to have, it has been longly anticipated. I've been waiting to do this, and I'm excited. So all my faith walkers, would you log in? Just say just say hello. Say how you doing. Let me know you're in the house. Sister Calvin, how are you? Come on, let me know you're in the house. We're excited to have you all on tonight. Tonight I have a special guest. One of my former students from the University of Oklahoma is with us on tonight, and I'm excited. Beyond excited to have him. And so please welcome tonight to our midweek motivation courageous conversation, Mr. Caleb Gayle. Come on in. All right. I know Chandler's here. I know Chandler's going to bring Caleb in. All right. There we go. All right. Hey, sir.
How are you all?
Man, Caleb, it is so good. You don't know how excited I am to have you on. So let me sing your praises first before we start anything. I have watched all of your interviews on YouTube, all of the people that interviewed you from a year and 2 years ago. But I can say that I knew you when you were a student at the University of Oklahoma. And it is a wonderful thing, Caleb, to see our students leave the University of Oklahoma and become as successful as you've become. So know that I brag about you. I use your book in my class. You are a proud, you should be a proud alumnus of University of Oklahoma, hopefully so. But also, you're a proud native of Tulsa by way of New York. We'll talk about that in a second, too. For those of you who don't know, I preached at Caleb's father's, his home church.
That's true.
I did do that, and that was an awesome experience. I'm beyond proud of you. Anytime we see our students achieve, you don't know how much I've anticipated this conversation with you. I tell Dr. Sherry all the time, I can't wait to get Caleb on, and this has been a long time coming for me, and so I'm glad. I'm humbled by your presence
Thank you,
tonight. You are, as a journalist and as a writer, writing the stories and narratives of things that I'm extremely interested in, and that is culture from the West. So do me a favor. Let me start. First of all, I need my people to welcome. Can y'all welcome Caleb to Midweek Motivation? Caleb, tell us a little bit of your history. Where you from? How you got to where you are to some degree, but really from New York to Tulsa. That's a great story. You told me that, and I thought that was interesting.
Sure. Yeah. I'm still, first of all, thank you so much for having me and even considering me and all those kind words. I really appreciate it. And definitely, I think that professors such as yourself were really key in helping students like me who might not have been able to see that far into the distance, helping us kind of have some semblance of what it might look like to kind of step out on faith and achieve some semblance of those dreams. So I really appreciate it. It feels like it's coming full circle. So my parents are from Jamaica, actually. But like most Jamaicans in the 60s and 70s, immigrated to New York. And for whatever reason, and I've asked my parents a million times, like, we just decided to go to Tulsa. There are like a lot of, I'm sure I could, all the reasons that they've offered me are insufficient, but we decided to leave kind of the comforts of just enormous amounts of Black people, not just Black people, but enormous amount, like high concentrations of Jamaican folks, because my grandfather was a Jamaican pastor who had a bunch of Jamaican and Bahamian and Barbadian congregants, and we left all of that in an instant. We're kind of dropped down into Tulsa. I distinctly remember the very first time we went to a Walmart, and we had never been to a Walmart before. People said, "God bless you," said hello. All of it was strange. And but very early into my time, as a way to kind of perhaps even kind of get a little bit to what I've written, it became very apparent to me as even a young child, I was about 8 when we moved, that Oklahoma had a variety of histories braided within it that were relatively different. And it didn't take very long, especially, just playing with kids my age, and they would try and point out these distinctive factors to me that I couldn't see with my naked eye, nor with my limited understanding of history at that time. I really didn't know what they were talking about, but they would say things that were relatively indelicate, which was, I got Indian in me.
Yeah.
It stuck with me for at that point decades, because it just seems so odd that kids who looked exactly like me, who shared the hue of my skin, would have such a very different tale to tell about their heritage.
Right.
And not only that, but even that first time to Walmart, I remember, especially when we were going in North Tulsa, right, the highest concentration of Black people in Tulsa live in North Tulsa. And I distinctly remember we were deep in North Tulsa, and there was kind of a place for people to hitch their horses, and there were guys who looked like me with their shirts off and paraphernalia that might have revealed some of their allegiances to various groups and societies, if you will, that were on horseback. And it just it didn't seem, it seemed as if they rode in a way that was confident enough in their experiences that they were evincing a history much greater than perhaps I could even understand until much later. So that's kind of a truncated portion of my story in Oklahoma.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting that you raised that, because in the introduction of the book, you raised that point about, I got Indian in me, when many African Americans all over, when I was growing up, that's what I was told. I was told that all my life, that I had Indian in me. So I grew up believing that a part of my narrative was that. Caleb, tell us about your book, We Refuse to Forget. Tell us about this book. I 2 questions. Tell us about the book, but also tell us about Cal Tom, one of the main characters in this book. That is absolutely amazing. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the best way to kind of talk about the book is that I was kind of at the office of the Guardian where I was working at the time. I was in between stories, which is the worst place a writer can be, especially when you write long stories like I do. And I distinctly remember, we have a bunch of television screens, and across the ticker of the AP Newswire was, Black families sue Muskogee Creek Nation citizenship. And a lot of those words I understood definitionally, but together they made no sense to me until I remembered these kids who used to tell me that I got Indian in me.
Right.
And so initially my instinct as a reporter, as a writer, is to just kind of, you kind of run towards the story. And so I just told my editor I'm going. And she was like, I guess you're going. And started to meet with people who had a very different narrative. And one of those people, of course, is Tamara Solomon Simmons, your frat brother, whose 4-time great-grandfather, right? And talking to him, he didn't, most family histories, family memories very different than history. It doesn't have necessarily a clear codified set of historiographical roots and alleys and constructions. So you're mining people's memories to provide plot to history, rich history.
Yes.
And so to some extent, it came in bits and pieces, and he introduced me to his grandmother, Johnny Mae Austin, and a constellation of people who refused to forget this portion of their family's histories. And in so doing, I got to encounter in the archives, but then also through their memories, this man named Cal Tom, who was often referred to as Miko Cal Tom, which signified that he was, in some senses, a chief. And what became clear to me is that this man who was born in 1810, my first encounter with him was in the journal of another white man's kind of catalog through his time in the Southwest. And I think oftentimes what we don't realize is that a lot of our histories as Black people are oftentimes marginal notes, right,
Yeah.
in someone else's
Yeah.
story. But it seemed to me that this interaction that this man named Ethan Howland Hitchcock had with Cal Tom told me something that was a little different, right? So essentially, Cal Tom was the interlocutor. He was the interpreter for the chief of the Creek Nation, a guy named Cat Yargi, back in the 1830s. And he told him of where he came from, which was what we think to be mainly the southeastern United States, potentially Western Florida, from the Yamasee tribe, which is a part of the Creek Nation. And he came over during what we would now consider the Trail of Tears, when thousands of indigenous peoples were uprooted by dictator Andrew Jackson to go west. And in that, Cal Tom was recounting his experiences. He's talking to this guy, and this guy says, well, what is it that you want? Well, he says, look, I want a school, I want a home, I want a grist mill. He kind of wanted his own facsimile of an American dream, but he wanted it in Indian territory, which enabled him to have a degree of liberty and freedom that he just would not have found in antebellum United States, especially in the South, right? And so to some extent, as a Black man, especially as the Civil War took off, and most people don't know, but significant and important battles were fought in what we now consider Oklahoma, Battle of Honey Springs, and that scattered a great deal of the Creek Nation. But in that time, a man rose up to become one of its chiefs, and that man was Cal Tom. And not only was he a chief, he also, in the wake of the Civil War, at the conclusion of it, a year after, in 1866, was sent by the Creek Nation to negotiate a peace treaty. That not only, among many other things that were included in that peace treaty, not only did he do that, he was also tasked with ensuring that in Article 2, Black people would be, people who were once held as slaves would be emancipated, but not only emancipated, they would be offered something that they couldn't find in the rest of the United States, which was birthright deeded land within the Creek Nation, which led for his family to access to a variety of experiences, opportunities that are even hard for us to find in 2025 for the average Black family today. So he was a critical figure who kind of served from a narrative perspective as kind of the linchpin that held the past and the present together.
Wow. Okay. In one of your interviews, you say this, and it was absolutely, I pressed rewind several times. You gave a number of how many years it would take for African Americans to catch up with white people as far as generational wealth. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So essentially the amount of years would be longer than the United States has ever been alive at this point. Like, longer than the United States has been constructed. And next year we celebrate 250 years, right? But to put an even finer point on it, especially in contrast to what the world that Cal Tom was able to build relative to the world that was at that time for Black people, the racial wealth gap, right? Not just in income, but in terms of true wealth, the racial wealth gap in 1860 was roughly between 56 or 60 to 1. So for every $1 Black dollar, a white person would, on average, right, have 60. And we usually have this notion in our minds that the average white person was a wealthy enslaver. No, I mean, we didn't have much of a middle class to speak of in 1860, white, Black, or otherwise. So even then, to take into that consideration, the average white person would then have 60 times that of a Black person. But then when you take that into consideration for what Cal Tom was able to build, not but 2 generations after, his grandson or grandson-in-law, if you will, Jake Simmons, would write in Booker T. Washington's magazine, The Southern Workman, I have a home of 10 rooms. I do $5,000 in 1890, and through 1915, I do $5,000 monthly in income. That grossed up today is hundreds of thousands of dollars, which when you compare that to the average Black person's wealth, even in Boston, right? That's where I live now. On average, Black people's net worth here is about $8. So even in real as well as absolute terms, what Cal Tom was able to build, because that land that he had would one day run rich with oil and also provide opportunity for land leasing and kind of an emergence of these, cavalier, sometimes swashbuckle talking leaders of industry came because he had a leg up that no one else really had around the country.
Right. That's amazing. I think those people, those who are watching, are amazed by that. Talk to me about, and you raised this in the book, talk to me about talking about white supremacy during this time that impacted African Americans as well as Black Creeks. White supremacy, especially from the federal government perspective.
Sure.
As you raise that, and that's very powerful.
Sure, yeah. So, put most simply, the goal when it came to Oklahoma, when we think about Oklahoma, oftentimes, we think about it being in the middle of the country. We're not really the South. We're not the Southwest. We're not the Midwest. We kind of exist out there.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the way in which the United States government saw Oklahoma initially was a place to kind of dispatch all their indigenous people. Like, just send them all there. They'll figure it out. We don't care, right? But then over time, as our appetite for Western expansion only grew in the United States, it was also an opportunity, as Oklahoma teetered on becoming from Indian Territory to a state. It became an opportunity for the country to re-examine and even experiment with what kind of future will we have, right? And so to some extent, Oklahoma then became a bit of a laboratory experiment atop the backs of a lot of indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, the question was, would we embrace kind of this much more diverse, much more inclusive way of thinking about things like citizenship and whatnot that a lot of these indigenous nations had cultivated over the course of centuries? Or would we go with this much more myopic, exclusive, white supremacy focused way of doing things? So the question was, how do we clear way for more people coming into Oklahoma? Of course, I'm oversimplifying it, but that for the purposes of this conversation, you can kind of think about it that way. How do we make more room? Right. So there was a guy named Henry Doss, who again is from where I am now.
That's right.
And he was seen before then as a relatively benevolent, pretty sympathetic to the abolition of not just slavery, but then also kind of the work of Reconstruction.
Right.
And he gives this speech where he says, look, the goal when thinking about the indigenous, right? He almost was like, look, we've solved slavery. We've solved Black people. Right. Now let's focus on the indigenous people, right? In very cavalier terms. And he says, look, what we need to do is to ensure that we assimilate the indigenous such that there is no difference between them and us. There's no need for reservations. There's no need for reparations. There's no need for a lot of things. So what he does is he forms a commission by the power of the United States government that would then dispatch agents throughout the entirety of what we now consider Oklahoma, and would use very shoddy genealogical tactics to then say, well, you'll be a full blood, you'll be mixed, you'll be a freedman, right? There was no nuance behind that, right? Like, for instance, Cal Tom and his descendants were never enslaved. So they weren't freedmen, they were fully Black Creek. But the notion that you couldn't be Black fully and a citizen of an indigenous nation was anathema to them. They just saw indigenous people as a race that could then be changed, manipulated, and reshaped, not a nation that needed to be negotiated with. Not a group of people who would organize themselves in a very civil way for centuries, long before we even came up with the notion of American democracy. So what he did was he dispatched all of these people, and it might seem like he was trying to create some sort of registry, which he did, called the Dawes Rolls, in which you would be full blood, Creek, whatever, right? It wasn't just that. It was also for the purposes of identifying how to then limit the amount of land holdings that they then had. It was held communally, right? They had a different way of doing things. It was very akin to what we might see in different parts of the African continent, where people might have held land communally, had ways and processes of doing so. So what they did was they would eyeball test it oftentimes and be like, you know what? You look a little too black to be Creek, or you look a little too white to be this. And they would decide in the moment, oh, this person's going to be this person's going to be that. And with that, you would get differentiated land holdings. And that land would be privatized. But during that process, indigenous people, inclusive of those who were Black and Creek, right? Just like DeMario's ancestors, just like how Tom's descendants, lost roughly about 90 million acres worth of land, right? That cleared the way for thousands and thousands of other people to do that. And so it had far-ranging, even as most recently a few years ago, these sorts of distinctions in race that were invented, right, for the purposes of servicing white supremacy and white greed, right, for more land. They still have far-reaching impacts today, but it started primarily because they wanted to encroach further and further on the land that was deeded to all of these indigenous nations. And they used the tools of racism and white supremacy as the means to do so.
Caleb. And it sounds like it's not something that did happen. It sounds like something that is happening even today.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. With you said in one of your interviews, of course, I went through all of your interviews, Caleb. So whenever you start talking about Governor Stitt, right, and some of the things that this present governor is doing in the state of Oklahoma as it relates to the tribes, but also as it relates to the teaching of certain aspects of history. How do you see that? You are teaching on things that, for all intents and purposes, are getting banned in schools, right? You say in one of your things about a proper learning of history. You use that term, a proper learning of it. I thought that was a powerful term, because all learning of history is not necessarily proper, right? You use that term, but you also write books and articles that, for all intents and purposes, are not welcome in many institutions, schools in particular. How do you counteract that? What do you have to say about that, and that overreaching of white supremacy into our government system, trying to control what kids are learning in school?
Yeah, I think, one of my mentors, a guy named Jelani Cobb, who writes for the New Yorker, and I think he's the dean now of Columbia's journalism school. He's a historian, and he always says that history really isn't a resume. And oftentimes we confuse ourselves, we delude ourselves into thinking that history is, right? That we are kind of constantly auditioning ourselves, right? You look at any resume, it's, you went here, then you went here, you just kept doing better and better, you accomplish more and more. History is an assemblage of our humanity and the decisions that we've made, good and bad. And we are capable of both. It's not an audition. And I think oftentimes, whether it's Governor Stitt or State Superintendent Walters or others, they want to transform or convert our history education into an audition, a resume, a job interview in which we are making ourselves look good for the purposes of making America not just quote unquote great again, but making America as distant as possible from its wrongdoings. When in actuality, us confronting those wrongdoings, what I try to do in my writing, us confronting the ways in which we fall kind of demonstrates our humanity, right? Our collective and individual humanity, because it also demonstrates there are impressive and amazing accomplishments that we've been able to make, huge strides that have happened, but we can't take one and not the other, which is what you do as a resume, right? Who would put on there, I slept on the job? Who would put on there, I stole time, I stole all the pens? Who would never say that?
That's good, Caleb.
What our goal is to tell rich stories, complex stories. What what hero's tragedy, right? If we're thinking about the basic Greek tragedy that you have probably encountered thousands of times,
Yeah.
in even the telling of sermons when we're identifying certain
Yes.
biblical characters,
Yes.
like David was not always the best character.
That's right.
But he is deeply admired yet and still, in part because whether it's Psalms, whether it's even Psalms 42, where he's like, man, I'm thirsty,
Right.
It's tough around here, right? That sort of approach to history that's honest, I think actually is also much more interesting. And because I teach history at Northeastern as well, at Northeastern University, a lot of my students are intrigued and feel as if they're being told a really interesting bedtime story almost, or a movie script when they hear about the fulsome nature of our history. So I think I get why a Governor Stitt, and I get why Secretary or Superintendent Walters, so on and so forth, want to make history into a resume. I get it, right? It's easier, it feels better, it makes you feel all nice and fuzzy inside.
Yeah.
But it's just not as interesting. It's really boring. And also it eradicates, it erases so many interesting stories, so many people, so many faces that look like mine, that look like yours, look like not ours, that are so important. And most importantly, I take great inspiration from the people that I write about, right? And I think some people might see that as perilous and dangerous, right? I think that's the alarm, right? Is that if students truly knew, if they truly understood certain activities, certain participations, would probably inspire maybe some of their righteous indignation.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay, but I don't think that's what you would do if you're auditioning for a job, if you're auditioning to make yourself look good.
And it's funny because I think you are being nice when you say that I think that the version of history that they want taught is deceptive and it's manipulative.
Oh, definitely.
And I'd press the envelope because it is deceptive and manipulative because it's not the truth, right?
Yep.
It is your version of the truth, which in many cases is deceiving the minds of hundreds of thousands of kids in the state of Oklahoma in particular.
Definitely. And it's also serving as a blueprint, right? It's not, I think one thing that's really important to always remember, even in my most recent story for the New York Times where I work now, it's the work that, for instance, Superintendent Walters is doing in Oklahoma on a variety of measures. He's I'm sure an interesting person, but he's not that inventive, right? It's not as if these are all of his ideas.
That's right.
They're not, and they're being scaled and they're testing it on purpose. And so to some great extent, like it was over 100 years ago when Oklahoma was being founded, and now Oklahoma again is being turned into a laboratory. And sadly, our students, children, our well-being collectively as a state is now again being used as kind of sadly collateral in that experimentation.
I have to ask you this, and then I'm gonna go to the new book. You said a line about one interviewer asked you why you wanted to study Oklahoma, and your response was you believe that the imminent expression of the nation comes from Oklahoma. Tell about that. That was a powerful. I don't think you know how powerful a statement that was. And you're hinting at it when you say Oklahoma's like a laboratory, right? So talk about that statement.
I think Imani Perry, who I love and whose work I think is amazing, wrote South to America, right? Because the assumption is that the whole nation had become the South. But when we got the opportunity in 1907 to readmit a new state, it wasn't as if it was like that, right? 1905, a bunch of indigenous nations tried to host their own state constitutional convention to admit themselves as the Sequoia Nation, or even, Edward McCabe, a Black man, tried to propose Oklahoma as a Black state. And the very first law that they passed, right, in Oklahoma,
Jim Crow,
segregation one, in which, to some extent, they made a choice back then to essentially export the worst of the South, right?
Yeah.
And make essentially Oklahoma the South again. So it's hard for me to see America and understand it fully without understanding Oklahoma, because to some extent it's been practice, right? It's been the dress rehearsal for America, especially that we see now. And so even, again, to your point, when it comes to questions of prayer in schools or you know, what they're going to teach in schools, right? Oklahoma is yet again, right, about to go argue before the Supreme Court on those very matters, because again, we've been used again as a laboratory to test out what kind of country we want to be.
Wow. So I got to shift gears real quick. Talk about I'm kind of biased because I do love, now that we've been here 26 years, I'm kind of biased, Caleb, because I do love Western culture. I do love rodeos.
Yeah.
And you wrote a wonderful article in the Atlantic on the Boley Rodeo. Talk about that article real quick, why you wrote that article, and then we'll go to the book and we'll talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think from like a literary perspective, like I love to find stories that seem super small,
right?
But once you get inside of them, they're much bigger, right? It's a question of nation. It's a question of whether or not people are going to lay fallow their ambition or harness it to try and recover and sustain a history that's so very powerful.
Right.
And so to be able to examine the pluck of those folks, it's really powerful. But then also the ways in which that pluck, that effort, that drive, that ambition echoes against a much larger history of an Oklahoma that had its chance to be, or at least pitched as some semblance of a promised land,
right,
for Black people,
right,
and to also then kind of counteract the narrative that cowboy culture or Western culture writ large is white. To be able to take that on was an even more interesting and fun challenge. I had to do it as a result because, for as far as I know, those guys who were hitching their rides at Walmart wearing their paraphernalia from their different groups and societies, if you will,
right,
those guys deserve beautiful sentences as well.
That's right. That's right. And one of the reasons why people ask me, I was born and raised in Chicago, of course, but I wear cowboy boots and cowboy hats almost every day. And one of the reasons why I'm fascinated with Black Western culture is because historically it was one of the few things in this part of the country that was our own. We owned it, right? When African Americans were denied the opportunity to compete in white rodeos, here comes the Black rodeo in these Black towns as a way to claim or reclaim their own heritage. It's much like Black journalism, like the Defender in Chicago, right? We're excluded from these places, and then we create our own, and it becomes almost majestic historically, right? For years, we have our own thing. So I love that article that you wrote. Also, I love it because Booker T. Washington says he visited Boley, Oklahoma twice, right? And he called Boley, Oklahoma one of the most enterprising towns that he had ever visited. This is an amazing history that I have as a pastor and as a professor tried to get people in Oklahoma to further embrace this native history, right? And not feel like an imposter in this state. Right? That's kind of my wheels are turning like that, right?
Yeah. And not just foreigners in your own state, but also like people who took that line from Horace Greeley, the famous newspaper man, "Go West, young man," right? Like that, those words were not heard simply by a bunch of white men.
That's right.
In fact, it was heard by thousands and thousands and thousands of Black people. That's part of the reason I wrote the book that I'm writing, that comes out soon, is because that story is fascinating. And to some extent, it's more well archived and documented than most of the stuff that I do. So those rodeos were oftentimes almost welcome signs, right? They were de facto, we made this and you're welcome here. It was a celebration of not just being welcome here, but of what could be built there.
That's right.
On their own accord.
That's right.
So
that's powerful. So let me get to the book. I want to hold you any further. So let's talk about the new book. I'm excited.
Mm.
I think the new book is, I think my son has a picture of the copy he's going to put up. Black Moses, A Song of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. This is how wonderful we get in this church thing. I'm able to put the picture of the book up before it comes out. All right. Thank you, Chandler. Tell us about Black Moses. What led you to write this book?
Sure. So I because I'm a nerd, because I'm in academia, I was reading an article from 1878 in the Chicago Tribune where a black man from Tennessee is being interviewed as he has escaped the clutches of kind of the white lash to Reconstruction.
Yes.
And he's asked, he's in St. Louis, cold, hungry, wet. It's the winter. He's never seen Missouri winter like that before, right? And the reporter asked him, like, what in the world are you doing here? And he said, we've tried Washington, we've tried Lincoln, we've tried Jackson. All of them let us down. We are our own Moses now. I tell them, we are
wow.
I am my own Moses. And when he said that, I knew I had something different.
Yeah.
Because part of the draw was that there was a man named Edward Preston McCabe, who was born in Troy, New York, never enslaved, kind of lived a bit of a primrose life, went to boarding school, went to Wall Street before being black on Wall Street was even a thing, was an advisor in Chicago to the Hotel King of Chicago, Potter Palmer, and also to the department store that you're probably very familiar with, Marshall Field, which
Marshall Fields, yes, sir.
He was an advisor at both of those, but realized that that was going to be the cap of his ascent and accomplishment.
Yeah,
because he was a black man. And so when the sound went out that Kansas, especially Western Kansas, had some opportunities for black people, he and his best friend, A.T. Hall Jr., the son of the founder of Quinn Emanuel, and that you probably are familiar with, decided to head off to Kansas and landed in a place called Nicodemus and refounded this town and began to send circulars to come to Kansas. And so thousands of black people made their way into Kansas thereafter, and they called them exodusters, named after the same people who, similar from the Bible, the Hebrews who were fleeing Egypt. Yeah, they came promising a promised land, and after McCabe ascended in power, became a massive power broker, became the very first statewide elected black official in American history in the West. He lost and decided he was going to try his hand and put all of his chips in on becoming the governor and senator, as he proposed it, of an all-black state. In fact, he said, we will tolerate white people at the absolute minimum, but we will have black teachers, Negro professors, Negro congressmen, governors, so on and so forth. And he had almost convinced Benjamin Harrison. He had a bevy of U.S. senators who were in drastic support of his efforts. And so it dawned on me that there was this kernel of an idea that, like Moses, he might have been able to see and envision what that promised land might have looked like. Yeah. But clearly, like Moses, he would never make it into the promised land. Wow. So the story is very much a little bit more narratively driven. Lots of gunfights and very Western in its organization, right? But it presents to some extent kind of the expanse, but also the limitations of black ambition in America.
The limitations of black ambition. Just speak about that, because what are those limitations? That is important. Just touch on that for a second. Touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, for McCabe, it was pretty clear that there was a real opportunity there, right? Senator Preston Plum, a lot of these guys who kind of cut their teeth on, the abolition of slavery, had been fighters in the Civil War, had been congressmen, had been in part of bleeding Kansas, who really were advocating. The issue is that the real limitation was that McCabe was seen as a potential solution to what the government had put as a Negro problem, right? And it's important, I think, that we define the Negro problem for a moment, only because by saying it was a Negro problem, all the maladies and issues that Black people had been experiencing, it abdicated the United States government from being able to say, well, perhaps we might have been responsible for at least some, if not all, of these Negro problems. So then let's empower Black people to then be the deciders as to how they might use our resources as a country to then solve those problems. But instead, they put him on his back foot and said, look, I mean, if you want to solve it, come up with something useful. And what it really came up against was the desire to surrender places like the West over to interests that were far whiter, far richer, and far more aggressive about the ways in which they would implement their vision. Essentially, what he was up against was the exportation of the worst parts of the South finding their way to Oklahoma, such that it didn't become a promised land for him or anyone else for that matter. It became an opportunity to seek extreme rents by people who were wanting cattle grazing, eventually oil and gas, so on and so forth. And those interests of Black people were limited as a result of that. So because it was a Negro problem, it didn't need U.S. solutions. It became a unburdened U.S. saying, sure, go ahead, kid, try and find out how that might go for you. And so that's fundamentally the limitation that I'm sure we can probably even see today, right? Like all of the problems perhaps that Black people are facing today are not in any way the fault of perhaps a government that might not have cared or invested. So if it's not their fault, then it's not their responsibility to help rectify the situation. So those same limitations we saw back then, we still see kind of now, ways that are increasingly less subtle than they were even a few months ago.
That's wonderful, Caleb. I am excited about this book. One of the things, of course, this idea of Oklahoma being an all-Black state was even raised by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He raises this idea. You know, I'm familiar with that out of Chicago, of course, but this idea in the 60s, he raised the idea of Oklahoma being an all-Black state. Do you think, I know that where you live, often there is more of a progressive mindset, but your writings, when you bring them down south, how are they received?
I mean, the book tour last time was pretty aggressively throughout the South. I think what's interesting is that there's a greater degree of hunger for those sorts of stories, right? That reflect experiences and regions of the country that are not here, right? Even though Boston, Northeast, so on and so forth has been they've shown a lot of love to me. Whenever I go to the South, there's almost a greater intensity and urgency around the issues being discussed because there's no distance between the maladies and the task of living every day. Right? So to some extent, that's where we're going to be doubling down a great deal is kind of all throughout the West and the South, is because we saw really phenomenal turnout, people really desperate to engage. And so we're excited to kind of see that happen again this time.
Let me thank you, Caleb. If any of the people that are watching, if you have a question, I want to just get an opportunity for people. If you have a question, please put the question in the comments. I really am excited about this book. I know I want to bring you to Oklahoma City. I want to bring you to Oklahoma City. I want you to do a book signing in Oklahoma City.
We'll do.
At my church. I want to bring you in. Of course, not only the book signing, but also give you an opportunity to speak. I know you still got some church in you. I know you got some church.
We do.
I know you still do. And so I want to give you an opportunity to speak and really sign copies of your book. What you're doing is groundbreaking and needed. And I would not only say the distance is closer here, but it's more urgent. Because we're living what you're writing about in real time in the 21st century, right? So whereas those things may have happened in the past, we're living in the moment of these things happening from the state level to the local level.
Definitely.
We're fighting those things. And
Definitely.
so, Caleb, I'm grateful for you joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Man, I can't tell you thank you enough. You have definitely opened eyes. So let me tell the audience, if you want to get it, it's called We Refuse to Forget by Caleb Gayle. And absolutely, I'm gonna get this signed when you come to Tulsa.
Yes, sir. And folks can pre-order the next book as well.
Yes. Black Moses. Put that back up, Chandler. Put that back up. Yes, you can pre-order this on Amazon. What other places?
That's right. That works just fine.
Amazon is fine. Okay, you can pre-order that. We just put the Amazon link in the comments, so you can click on that. Big screen, Chandler. You can click on that, and you can order the book. This was absolutely amazing. Please give our best to your wife.
Will do.
And man, I'm excited about what you're gonna do in the future. As soon and if we have to book you before the book comes out, I need access to your agent.
Well, we will make sure to Oklahoma City's on the list, Tulsa's on the list. We will definitely make sure and liaise with you long before all of that.
Please. Thank you to all of you all watching. Would you all thank Caleb Gayle for me in the comments? I really want to let him know that we in Oklahoma, the 405 as well as the 918, still consider him one of ours. I know Boston has changed you some degree, but you still from this part of the country.
Definitely.
Man, Caleb, thank you, man. You have a good night, sir.
Same to y'all. I really appreciate y'all making the time. Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you. Hey, y'all, that was absolutely amazing. Can I just tell you all, as someone who teaches history at the academy level, I am in awe of Caleb Gayle, who's an awesome writer, a journalist, a historian. He's all of those things. I hope you all were blessed tonight with that information, with that history, with all those. And this is often what Black History Month is about. It's about us lifting our culture, right? It's about us acknowledging who we are as a people. And so I'm grateful for Caleb Gayle coming on tonight. Listen, if you can you like and share this conversation? Just click your share button. Share this conversation with somebody. Please share this conversation with somebody. This is an amazing conversation with an author. And we anticipate his new book, Black Moses, his conversation regarding Edward McCabe trying to make Oklahoma an all-Black state. I'm looking forward to that book. Hey, listen, we love y'all. I'm grateful for you all. Please like and share this link with somebody else. Listen, we had a great time at church on Sunday. Church was off the chain. The food was wonderful. Brother Usher, Sister Usher, all of those who worked in the kitchen were wonderful. We thank God for them. Can y'all thank God for them? They were wonderful. The food was amazing. The worship was even more amazing. But listen, this Sunday is coming, the 1st of March. You don't want to miss church. So listen, grab a friend, grab a neighbor, anybody and everybody, bring them to the 5th on Sunday. We intend to have a word from the Lord, okay? Let me pray. God, our Father, we thank you. Thank you for Caleb, God. We thank you for his life. Thank you for his gift. Thank you for his intelligence. Thank you for his brilliance, God. We thank you for everything. Cover his family in the name of Jesus. Thank you for all those watching tonight. God, we pray for our strength, for our peace and our joy. I choose joy because I'm a faith walker. I choose joy because I'm a faith walker. God, we thank you again. In the name of Jesus, bless our church, bless our ministry. In Jesus' name, every heart said amen. Love y'all. See you on Sunday.